The hum was almost kind, a low vibration threading through the fog like a pulse under skin. Then came the metallic rhythm, hull against tide. Steady, unhurried, deliberate. I remember thinking it sounded too small to matter. That was before I saw what it could do. The ocean held its breath that morning, waiting for something to prove the rumors right. We'd heard the name whispered around the docks for months. Tiny Terror, they called it. Part insult, part myth. A craft so small it disappeared between waves, yet fast enough to outmaneuver ships 10 times its size. I didn't believe it, not then. I'd spent too long inside steel corridors where volume equaled value, where commanders spoke in tonnage and firepower. Small meant expendable. I was part of a division built to be overlooked. The maintenance crew, the spare minds in borrowed uniforms. When the first prototype cut across the channel, its wake drew a single white line through the gray, neat as a signature. The water folded around it like an opening secret. There was no roar, no fanfare, just that restrained hum, and the quiet authority of something that didn't need to announce itself. Silence versus thunder, small versus mighty. Every contrast I'd been trained to ignore came alive in that instant. They had laughed at us during briefings, said our designs belonged in museums, not battlefields. Toy boats against an empire, one officer joked, tapping my shoulder like he was doing me a kindness. I nodded because arguing would have been noise, and noise wastes power. Instead, I started collecting details. The vibration frequency, the fuel ratios, the shape of the wake, as if each note could build a defense the world hadn't thought to respect yet. The fog thickened, wrapping sound in velvet. I remember the salt on my tongue, the cold sting of oil on water, the feeling that the ocean was remembering with me. Every ripple was a record. Every current carried the echo of something underestimated. The small engine faded into the distance, but its memory stayed, a hum that never really stopped. By the time the tide turned, I already knew. The future wouldn't roar, it would whisper, and I intended to listen. By morning, the sea had gone still. No wind, no hum, just the low crackle of salt drying on metal. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort but clarifies. I sat with it, replaying every meeting, every thinly veiled dismissal. The memory of their laughter had weight, but the quiet after held more. The Admiral's voice lingered longest. He wasn't unkind, not really, just certain. Certain that strength meant size, that control required volume, that history had already proven people like me wrong. He'd earned his medals in open water battles where power was visible and loud. Cannons, fleets, spectacle. I could almost respect that certainty, even as it fenced me out. Almost. We'd been told to stay out of the deep. Too risky, too untested, too small. So, they cut our budget, reassigned our personnel, left us with half a dock and fewer hours of daylight. What they didn't take was resolve. That's the part you can't measure on a ledger. I learned early that retaliation done in silence moves farther than shouting ever could. I wrote everything down, the dates of funding denials, the memo from procurement, the offhand remark that our little experiments made the Navy look unserious. Each insult became a data point, a coordinate. It wasn't rage that built the list, it was arithmetic. I wasn't after revenge. Revenge burns fast and leaves you standing in smoke. I wanted something clean, a proof. So, I waited. Not passively, but precisely. The ocean teaches that. You don't fight the current, you read it until you know when to move. My notebooks filled with sketches and possibilities, hull modifications, sonar masking, range extensions. Late nights blurred into early mornings, my mind tracing routes that didn't require permission. Still, there was a question I couldn't quiet. How could something so small alter the course of a war built on magnitude? Every answer I found came back to the same truth. Power isn't always about force. Sometimes it's about angle, about how and when you strike. The Admiral believed in dominance. I believed in leverage. That difference would become the fault line beneath everything that followed. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was potential, waiting to move. And somewhere beyond the horizon, I knew the tide was already starting to turn. By the time winter settled in, the docks had begun to rot from the inside out. Paint peeled in long, tired strips. Rust bloomed along the railings like bruises no one bothered to cover. We were the leftover minds, engineers without funding, technicians without rank. quietly assigned to maintain vessels that hadn't seen open water in years. It was a posting meant to fade us out. Yet, in the silence of decay, I found space to think. Then versus now. Back then, we answered to every command, spoke only when prompted, measured success by how invisible we could make ourselves. Now, we moved like shadows. Silent operators tracking enemy routes through the static hum of sonar. There was something pure in that shift, from obeying noise to mastering quiet. The irony didn't escape me. The same stillness they took for weakness became our weapon. The Admiral's orders never reached us directly anymore. He delegated oversight to junior officers who carried their authority like borrowed armor. They weren't cruel, just afraid. Afraid that if our little experiments worked, the old order would crumble. Fear of irrelevance masquerades well as arrogance. I saw it in the way they inspected our reports with polite disinterest, as if pretending not to care could stop evolution. For 8 months, we waited on procurement approval for basic sonar equipment. 8 months of forms, inspections, and rejections stamped with phrases like non-essential and pending review. Bureaucracy has its own tempo. Sluggish, resistant, full of friction. We learned to work within it, forging parts from scrap, trading favors for access. I once spent 3 nights machining a calibration rod from salvaged metal just to test a frequency adjustment. It wasn't rebellion, it was precision. The first time we ran a live sonar test, the silence felt louder than the engine. The pulse cut through the water, then returned, soft, delayed, almost shy. Each echo told a story, depth, distance, movement. We could map the unseen with whispers. That was the moment I understood that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in the space between signals. I began recording every test, labeling the files with quiet defiance. E01, E02, E03, knowing someday those logs would be our proof. The dockyard that once smelled of rust and neglect now carried a hum of purpose beneath its decay. They thought we were obsolete, but obsolescence is just what people call innovation before it proves them wrong. When the final approval finally came through, a single email stamped 08-1204 after 8 months of silence, I didn't celebrate. I simply marked the date in my logbook. Some victories aren't meant to be loud, they're meant to last. By dusk, the harbor kept the hush we'd learned to honor, and the list of what we'd been denied sat like an accusation on my desk. The hook came quick. A scrap sketch of a hull that wouldn't look like a weapon on the parade ground, but would behave like one once the water remembered its shape. We decided there'd be no spectacle. While ceremonial navies paraded tonnage under floodlights, we worked in the opposite register. Secrecy over show, slow accumulation over sudden noise. The plan was simple in principle and brutal in logistics. Design a fast, unmanned strike craft built from salvaged modules and exacting tolerances. It would be small enough to be dismissed and precise enough to be lethal in effect, a geometry of leverage rather than brute force. I kept a stack of hand-drawn blueprints in a folder marked maintenance because maintenance rarely gets inspected. The first blueprint was a scribble on an oil-stained envelope. A 7.2-meter hull, twin micro-turbines, modular payload bay, a keel profile tuned for low wake. I annotated it with numbers. Expected top speed 42 knots, fuel range 120 nautical miles at cruising speed, displacement under 3 tons. Facts meant to make an admiral's head tilt in either alarm or disbelief. Smuggled schematics arrived in pieces. I met a former contractor in a parking lot behind a supply depot and exchanged a thumb drive for an old lunchbox and a favor. The schematics were blueprints for sensor arrays and fuel injectors, redacted and annotated by hands that knew how to hide what mattered. Each file bore a timestamp and a checksum. Craft like ours needed mathematical certainty because they couldn't afford improvisation. We tracked expenses down to $3,100 per prototype in a clandestine ledger, hidden under a maintenance requisition. There were frictions you can't glamorize. Approval to prototype a remote control system required signatures we would never receive. The procurement office demanded a line item in a budget we didn't have. Parts sat on backorder lists for months. One supplier quoted a 12-week lead time for hardened bearings. So we substituted. Bearings machined from a decommissioned winch, wiring repurposed from a retired patrol boat, a COS. Intro module assembled from consumer drones and military-grade encryption chips. Our tests happened at night, under a looting of fog and the minimal light of a single lamp. We launched in silence, noting tachometer readings, GPS drifts, fuel consumption logs, and camera feeds stamped with UTC times. I logged every test as if it were evidence for trial. Test E12-0217 UTC, wake profile within acceptable margin. Acoustic signature below threshold X. Those files would later read like receipts, not rhetoric, not boasting, only proof. Ever been told you're too small to matter? Keep listening. That question was not an invitation, it was a rubric. We measured outcomes, iterated, and buried our failures beneath new trials. Each modest success rewired our confidence. Small craft could be precise, precision could change calculus. In the quiet between launches, I traced the hull lines on my palm, water as memory, and imagined the way a wake records intention. We were building not a spectacle but a solution, and that discipline would be our currency as we moved from planning to action. By dusk, the blueprint had folded into schedule and the plan stopped being an idea and became an inventory. Under a single lamp, we turned paper into parts, and under the same lamp, we learned to keep our voices small. Smallness was deliberate. Secrecy versus spectacle steered every choice. I watched sketches become frames and frames become hulls, each stage documented in a stack of artifacts that would later read like a ledger of intent. We converted a rusting warehouse into a workshop with care. Blueprints with inked annotations sat beside field notes scrawled on requisition forms. Test logs accumulated on a thumb drive labeled calibration. Payroll ledgers showed stipends paid in cash to off-sheet laborers. Coded messages moved through hobbyist radio repeaters to schedule test windows at 02, 12 and 0330 UTC. Every file bore a UTC timestamp and a terse label. The boats took shape with insistence. Metal bent to templates, welds sealed seams, and microturbines found homes where engines had never fit before. We reused fittings, scavenged sensors, and adapted a sonar block salvaged from a retired buoy. I learned to read the sound of a trial like a doctor reads a pulse. The water began to mirror our discipline. Each launch left a wake that looked back at us cleaner than the last. Then came the pattern interrupt. A routine audit unfolded like bad weather. Procurement flagged irregular fuel requisitions. Quantities didn't match declared training use. Transfers were routed through a shell account. The auditors were polite yet precise. No single document screamed guilt, but the arithmetic did not lie. We had $42,000 diverted across maintenance line items over 6 months, small entries like hose replacement and galley supplies that, added together, formed a deliberate current. Every fake invoice was a tiny artifact, a vendor name, a phone number that rolled to an old voicemail, a photocopied stamp. I cataloged them in a file named Audit Response Draft v1.docx with a 091407 timestamp. The simplest option was denial. The smartest was alignment. So we repackaged the operation under training exercises and produced a packet of plausible objectives, route maps, and safety briefings stamped to match official submissions. Hiding operations under training created new frictions. The training office demanded weekly reports, which forced us to schedule real, controlled runs to match the paperwork. Every paper lie required a physical echo. One night a harbor patrol came closer than usual and the bow camera logged their hull number at 0312 UTC. We cross-referenced and adjusted our debrief to account for the sighting. It was tedious, brittle work, but honesty of movement made the fiction hold. Money was delicate. The $42,000 was not large enough to prompt an outright crisis. Minor probe, yet it could kill a program if traced. We routed expenses through maintenance accounts and a dormant petty fund tied to community outreach. Each invoice read like plausible need: bulk lubricants, dock line servicing, emergency patch materials. Someone even photocopied a cafe receipt and stained it to simulate age. Small details bought credibility. The human ledger tracked too. We shortened sleep, accepted second shifts to cover true wages, and traded favors for parts. A machinist reassigned from fleet overhaul arrived each morning with a thermos and a calm face. He never spoke of the admiral, only of bolts that needed precise torque. His presence was a quiet vote for work that mattered over work that was seen. We kept meticulous receipts, tachometer readings, fuel burn charts, camera feeds stamped with UTC, payroll entries marked consulting. The calibration thumb drive held files named E01 through E27, with notes like 0217 UTC, wake within margin, acoustic signature, X. Those logs were not boastful, they were proof. When the audit closed with an innocuous recommendation for improved procurement tracking, we exhaled and tightened. Secrecy had bought time. That time had to be converted into undeniable evidence. The boats were assembled, the receipts existed, and the water had begun to reflect who we were becoming. The ledger filled, the wake lengthened. We rehearsed the demonstration until silence itself felt intentional. Now we would need to show, not tell, and prepare for the moment the Admiral could no longer look away. The first rumor arrived disguised as a logistics memo. Unidentified wake observed near Sector 12. No signature. No timestamp beyond 0400 local. I printed it, read it twice, and pinned it to the wall. Not because it surprised me, but because it didn't. The ocean was starting to talk back. By then, we had 6 crafts opus, rational. Not finished, not perfect, but capable. Each had a name scratched into its frame with the blunt end of a file. Not heroic names, just numbers and initials, small human proofs of unseen labor. We launched them at night, far beyond radar grids, timing departures to coincide with freight traffic. Rumor versus reality had become our camouflage. We hid truth inside noise. The first test run logged a consistent 41 knots in mild surf, acoustic signature nearly indistinguishable from driftwood. On the monitor, the vessel looked like a pulse skipping across dark glass. At 0314 UTC, the camera feed showed its reflection, water as mirror, a fragment of ourselves staring back. The operators barely spoke. We didn't need to. Every hum, every vibration carried its own language now. Weeks later, whispers reached command, phantom craft, invisible vessels, ghost signatures. I recognized the tone, curiosity dressed as control. The Admiral summoned his analysts, demanded explanations, and received only data that refused to conform. He didn't know the reports came from his own patrols. He didn't know the tide he'd ordered us to avoid was already ours. He called for a demonstration. The irony was almost elegant. He thought it would prove our failure, not his oversight. Orders circulated through channels with his stamp. Request for controlled trial of microcraft initiative. Controlled, as if control still belonged to him. What he didn't realize, the demonstration was already underway. We had launched the previous night. Our 6 crafts moved in formation across 3 nautical zones, logging telemetry to a secure server in the dockyard. From shore, we watched their tracks render as thin white threads on the monitor. 6 precise lines cutting through static. Each thread crossed coordinates that matched active patrol routes. Minutes later, new memos began populating the Admiral's inbox. More sightings, conflicting locations, impossible speeds. I imagined his face when he read them. Not anger, not disbelief, but the slow erosion of certainty. His arrogance had always been orderly, the kind that thrives in neat reports and predictable hierarchies. Now he faced chaos, wearing the mask of precision. He would have to reconcile the contradiction, how something so small, so dismissed could move faster than his understanding. Still, I didn't hate him for it. His conviction came from habit, from decades of equating mass with mastery. Men like him built their lives around the belief that only the visible matters. But water teaches otherwise. What moves beneath it shapes what floats above. At 0403 UTC, the crafts executed their final maneuver, a simultaneous sonar ping that echoed through the bay like a single note held too long. On the monitors, the reflection fractured, shimmered, then disappeared into stillness. Silence, absolute and deliberate. I saved the recording under the file name Proof 01. By dawn, the Admiral would have his answer, though he wouldn't yet understand the question. Rumor had turned real, and reality had turned quiet. He'd asked for evidence, but what he'd receive was consequence. I watched the surface settle back to calm, the horizon empty again, and thought how fitting it was that the first proof of power looked exactly like absence. The wake faded. The world above slept on. Only the mirror knew what had passed beneath. The morning after the demonstration, the bay looked unchanged. Flat light, soft mist, but the current underneath had shifted. For the first time, command was silent. That kind of silence doesn't soothe, it calculates. Within 48 hours, the pushback began. It started small. Our next shipment of composite resin was delayed in transit. Then our fuel allocation dropped without explanation. I checked the inventory logs, entries deleted, line items marked administrative review. Bureaucracy moves slowly, but it crushes fast. The system didn't shout its refusal, it starved us of resources until motion itself became an act of defiance. A week later, the investigation notices arrived. Standard forms printed on heavy paper, signed by people who'd never stepped inside our dock. The language was polite, clinical. Irregular procurement patterns require internal verification. They didn't need to say the word sabotage. I could read it between the lines. I filed our responses methodically, attaching receipts, timestamps, and procedural jargon dense enough to bore an auditor into inaction. Precision versus panic. That was our edge now. While they argued semantics, we kept building. Then came the personnel transfers. 2 of our core engineers were temporarily reassigned to coastal maintenance, officially for skill redistribution, unofficially for containment. They were given 48 hours to relocate. One left without a word, the other stayed until midnight, tightening bolts on a hull that would never bear his name. He left a note folded beneath a torque wrench: "Keep it quiet, make it count." We did. But control came at a cost. Our work paused for 3 weeks waiting for legal clearance on prototype deployment. 3 weeks of stillness in motion, a waiting room made of salt air and suspicion. During that time, the dockyard felt like a held breath. I filled it with paperwork, requisitions rewritten, logs cross-checked, compliance manuals annotated until my pen tore the page. We were surrounded by control measures, yet the chaos outside was louder than ever. When approval finally arrived, the authorization code was 3 digits off from what I'd requested. A clerical error, they said. It delayed deployment another 72 hours. In war, delays kill without drawing blood. We launched anyway. The night was cold, the water a sheet of black glass. 6 vessels left the dock, only 5 returned. The missing one, E-19, went dark midway through the route. No signal, no debris, no distress ping, just silence. The crew was 2 people, Lynn and Ramos. Both had been with me since the first test. Both had believed that precision could rewrite doctrine. When command demanded an incident report, I wrote 12 pages of measured language. No speculation, no blame, only data. But silence carries its own grammar. I kept hearing it in the hum of the remaining crafts, in the faint pulse of sonar against distance. The ocean never forgets what it takes. Next morning, I found Lynn's last transmission buried in the raw log feed. Turbine stable, visibility low, maintaining heading. That was all. No alarm, no fear, just order amid chaos. It was exactly how she lived, precise, contained, resolved. After that, we operated with tighter margins. Supply chains rerouted through secondary ports, fuel smuggled in under emergency maintenance. Every delivery required negotiation. A signature here, a favor there. The system tried to drown us in procedure, but bureaucracy has one weakness: it can't keep pace with intent. Our boats moved faster than paperwork. Their precision outpaced policy. Each successful run became another quiet declaration that control was ours again. The Admiral's office issued new directives about unmanned vessel oversight, trying to reclaim authority through language, but power doesn't return through memos, it leaks away in the space between words. The investigation deepened, but by then we had learned how to hide progress in plain sight. Our test data was disguised as wave resistance research. Our prototypes were labeled buoyancy studies. Every report that passed his desk read like compliance. Every result beneath it was revolution. Sometimes, when the wind cut across the harbor just right, I could still hear E-19's frequency, a faint, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat underwater. The technicians told me it was just interference, but I kept the channel open anyway. Silence, I'd learned, isn't absence. It's what remains when everything else has been stripped away. We lost 2 friends, 1 vessel, and several months of safety. But the plan endured, sharpened by loss. Chaos had thrown its weight against us, and control, quiet, deliberate control, had held. When the next order came down from command, requesting a comprehensive status report, I smiled for the first time in weeks. The storm had passed, but it hadn't won. In the calm that followed, I wrote one final note at the top of the log. Silence in the storm is not surrender, it's navigation. The summons came at dawn, printed on letterhead that still smelled of fresh ink. Report aboard the flagship at 0900 hours for formal debrief. No signature, just the emblem. An eagle clutching anchors. That kind of invitation isn't optional. It's an order disguised as formality. I folded it once, slipped it into my jacket, and went. The deck of the flagship was too clean, too bright. Every surface gleamed as if fear had been polished away. The admiral waited by the command table, posture carved in the same precision as the steel around him. He didn't offer a handshake, only a nod, measured, wary, the gesture of a man who has already read the rumors but hopes they aren't true. "Your operation," he began, voice steady but clipped, "has attracted more attention than authorization." I met his gaze. "That's what truth does, sir. It surfaces." He blinked once, maybe twice, before gesturing to a chair. The room held a dozen officers pretending not to listen, but I could feel their attention tighten like wire. Calm versus panic. I had both in my hands and could decide which would speak first. I opened the case I'd brought, a simple metal brief, matte finish. Inside, data drives, printed logs, field certifications, and a single sealed envelope labeled Operational Proof, Verified. The admiral leaned forward, the way someone does when they sense the ground about to tilt. "These," I said evenly, "are the results of 12 successful missions. Real telemetry, verified by your own command stations. Each one logged, time-stamped, and signed by independent officers. You'll find your initials on 3 of them." He reached for the papers as if they might burn. His hand shook, barely perceptible but not hidden. The footage played on the wall monitor, 6 small craft moving in unison, cutting through fog, vanishing before radar sweeps could catch them. The room filled with the faint sound of water and engine hum. Silence carried more authority than any speech could. "I was told these vessels were prototypes," he said quietly. "Experimental only." "They were," I replied, "until you asked for proof." The line landed between us, calm but sharp. I saw the realization settle, not anger, not defeat, but recognition. He'd built his life on the belief that power required presence. Now, watching the silent fleet rewrite that rule, he understood the equation had changed. His empire of size had been outmaneuvered by precision. He turned away, walked to the window overlooking the bay. The reflection of the sea danced across the steel floor, water as mirror, showing both what was and what would be. "You've redefined the doctrine," he said finally. "Do you understand what that means?" "Yes," I said. "It means we adapt, or we sink." The words hung in the air, clean and final. For a moment, the room was still enough to hear the distant waves slap the hull. When he faced me again, his voice had softened. "What do you want, Commander?" "Not victory," I said. "Continuity." I slid a folder toward him. Inside was a proposal, a new division, autonomous operations, oversight shared, credit distributed. "I'm offering you a seat at the table you once dismissed, quietly, without humiliation." That was the mercy, not erasure, but inclusion. He studied the folder, then closed it with a small, decisive click. "You always were too calm," he murmured. "Calm gets farther than noise," I said. He nodded once, the smallest concession a man of his rank could make. "Proceed." As I left the room, the hum of the flagship's engines followed me. Steady, low, familiar. Outside, the sea looked still, but I knew better. Beneath that calm, the current was already rewriting the map. By the time the directive arrived, the ink barely had time to dry before copies were scanned, stamped, and filed under Naval Order 17B, Autonomous Craft Integration Initiative, date, June 3, 2026, signature, Rear Admiral J. Hollis, the same man who once called us toy boat dreamers. It landed on my desk with the weight of quiet vindication, the kind that doesn't need applause to be complete. The order redrew boundaries, literal and symbolic. No more budget freezes without review. No more dismissals disguised as restructuring. The docks that had been sealed, padlocked, and left to rust were reopened under a new insignia, a silver wake cutting through black water. Where exclusion once lived, access now moved freely. Apprentices arrived in clusters, sleeves rolled, notebooks ready. They listened more than they spoke, which told me they understood what kind of legacy they were inheriting. The first weeks were slow, procedural, new safety, audits, equipment inspections, background checks. Progress under regulation always feels like walking through current, resistance, but direction. Still, each morning I watched those small vessels rise from their berths, one by one, like breaths released after holding too long. The water remembered, even when people tried to forget. The admiral visited once, unannounced. No entourage this time. Just him, standing on the pier with his cap tucked under his arm. "They're smaller than I imagined," he said quietly, watching the crafts glide. "They're precise," I replied. "And that's the point." He nodded, no pride left to defend, only respect earned the hard way. When he left, I noticed he paused to touch the rail. The same corroded steel we'd once welded by hand. The gesture was small, but I counted it among our victories. Inside the command room, the new recruits ran simulations on equipment that still bore our handwriting and marker, voltage notes, calibration reminders, initials smudged from years of salt and heat. I didn't erase them. History, even the flawed kind, deserves to be legible. Contrast defines memory, exclusion versus access, dismissal versus recognition. We had lived both. What remained was balance, a structure strong enough to hold progress without arrogance. Our silence had been our armor, but now it was our method. Deliberate, focused, self-contained. At the end of each briefing, I left them with the same line I used to remind myself during the long nights of uncertainty. Remember this: silence doesn't mean absence, it often means preparation. They'd nod, half understanding for now. In time, they'd learn what the ocean already knew, that the quiet ones are never still. They're gathering force beneath the surface, waiting for the right tide. At dawn, the water was flat as glass. No wind, no trace of struggle, only the long reflection of a horizon that refused to end. The chaos that once filled the docks had drained away, replaced by clarity so complete it almost felt rehearsed. Where there had been orders shouted over static, there was now the measured hum of engines tuned for purpose, not for war. We had started sketching new blueprints, not for weapons this time, but for rescue fleets. Compact vessels that could reach storm zones faster than any ship of state, guided by the same precision that once unsettled admirals. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same design that defied an empire would soon be saving fishermen, families, entire coastlines. Past chaos versus future clarity, that was the evolution we'd earned. The civilian engineers arrived with open notebooks, ready to learn. We taught them the language of water, drag coefficients, current prediction, the art of reading waves like maps. They brought warmth where once there had been suspicion. The sea, always our mirror, now reflected something quieter. Not defiance but discipline transformed into grace. Standing on the pier, I listened for that sound, the one that began it all. The low, steady hum beneath the surface, controlled, deliberate, unstoppable. They called us small, they just mistook precision for weakness.